The Beatles are breaking up.
The Beatles' breakup caused some irreparable damage to fans worldwide. However, there was a glimmer of hope for two of the most powerful forces in the Fab Four to reunite, as Paul McCartney and John Lennon reconciled after a messy feud. They were never going to reunite alone, as they were thinking of forming a supergroup with none other than the late and great David Bowie. One night out in 1974 almost changed the trajectory of all three of their careers, as they discussed a supergroup and even came up with a name. However, that conversation only lasted a night, and it was never brought up again. Sadly, this means that one of the biggest what-ifs in music history will forever remain unsolved. After the Beatles disbanded, there was little to no hope of the Fab Four being a unit again. The relationships and bonds between the former bandmates were nearly beyond repair, especially between Lennon and McCartney, whose feud turned public and spiteful. However, in 1974, they were friends again, and a possible reunion was on the cards. They knocked on Bowie's hotel door in Manhattan one night, who was working on a project. Bowie opened the door to Lennon and McCartney to his surprise. Two icons who were involved in the biggest and most public feud were suddenly joined at the hip. They also happened to be his biggest heroes. As Bowie once said about Lennon, "He was one of the major influences on my music life. I just thought he was the very best of what could be done with rock and roll and also ideas." In astonishment at seeing his heroes on his doorstep, Bowie said, "Wow, I thought you two had..." And Lennon responded with, "Oh no, all that's going to change." In an interview on BBC Six Music with Mark Riley, Bowie detailed the night he almost got two of the Beatles back together via a collaboration. "We just spent the evening talking," he said. That must have been the first evening they were back together since the big bust-ups. They actually asked me if I'd join the two of them and become a trio with them, and we'd change the name to something like David Bowie and the Beatles, because they liked the idea of it being DBB Bowie, and the former Beatles discussed the idea all night, over drinks and drugs, until the next morning. When that morning came, the talk of forming what could have been the biggest and most iconic supergroup was over. The idea and the excitement wore off, and they went their separate ways, robbing generations of music listeners of the privilege of hearing an iconic supergroup made up of two Beatles and David Bowie. There is no complicated reason as to why the supergroup was never formed. As soon as Lennon and McCartney left the hotel where Bowie was staying, the idea was never mentioned again. "It just never came to anything," Bowie said when discussing why the supergroup never happened. "It was an amazing idea that never came to fruition." What that night in 1974 also confirmed something about the two Beatles members. A reunion was definitely in discussion. In 1980, in an interview that took place shortly before his untimely and unexpected death, Lennon stated that he was open to a reunion because he and McCartney were close again. Lennon revealed that he was planning a surprise reunion with McCartney on Saturday Night Live in the mid-1970s, but ultimately decided against it. At the time of the conversation, all three were making waves in the music scene on their own. Lennon was on the rise as a soloist and released Imagine, an important track that resonated for decades. Bowie made a breakthrough with his approach to avant-garde rock and eventually collaborated with some of music's greats. McCartney, who formed his own band called Wings, was also deeply focused on his craft and went on to become a prominent music figure for decades.